Alright, everybody. So this is our round 2.5 for self-harm. Sorry, slamming the cup down. I don't know why I did that. Forgot I put the mic on top of where I usually put all my cups. Anyways. So this is going to be a quick little ditty. We're going to make a video probably within the next couple hours that's going to be a discussion on theocracy. So if you guys want to come back around for that, that will be a thing. But for now, we're just going to have just a normal webcam free chat. Kind of little mini confessional. A little bit of I guess a sense of, like I was saying, sense of keeping personal accountability, but also discussing the process by which probably we all fail. Because if I'm failing, then somebody else is probably failing, which means somebody else is probably failing, and all of us, because of what traits we share as human beings, are likely all suffering for the same type of things. So, looking at it as a pathogen, and looking at the idea of dealing with whatever disease that I'm fighting through, we're going to discuss it, basically that process by which I believe that disease kind of affects me, kind of ripping off of what we were talking about in round 2, and my observations of how it is that I myself allow myself to, in a sense, miss the mark or sin. For that, we're just going to go and just have a normal conversation. No charts, we don't need any type of definitions. I'm going to be on all that stuff later, so I'm trying to save my brain power for processing all that then. But for this small little conversation that we were going to have, I would like to say that perhaps the best way of looking at this is not, this is how this works, but more so, this is how the disease is affecting this organism that is myself. So, in a sense, I would be the specimen of research for investigative research, and for our sense of what we're trying to deduct from the observations of the traits that qualified me being infected or having an altered physiology as an organism. All of that should be then reapplied to your own personal life for the similarities and differences, and then thus looking into your own organism and whether or not that's applicable to your situation. All in all, if you haven't watched the other videos, I can't really help you there, because to give you guys a rundown of the basics of what sin is, and the idea of applying sin to mental health, into physical health, and to use your religious life or your religious beliefs in the fight to help with the secular means by which we combat these issues. All that stuff is in round 1 and 2. Watch those. They're kind of long. I know. I apologize. Watch it on 2 times speed. Then I'll sound like a chipmunk, but at least you'll get it, and you'll at least be able to finish it within like 30 minutes to an hour. But otherwise, just listen to it like a podcast, I would say. Last thing before we kind of launch into this, I would say is how would I put this? Relapse has to do with the idea of the deterioration of a condition. It is about a pre-state A, and a future state B. And that in the progress between state A and B, one runs into interference. We don't need to explain this. One runs into interference from A to B at point, AB, this intersection point, AC, where this line comes in and the past man comes in. So if your A to B would be the line drawn across your plane of life, A and B would be you as you were before you came to Christ, and you when you're fully coming to complete fellowship and ownership with God and bonding with God. So that would be A to B. Intersecting point AC would be the point by which line C would connect through it, and line C would be the you who is line A to C would be the you that continues on your life as if you are dead, or as if you were living in sin, in a sense, living out of darkness, or living without a sense, or in a sense of moral relativity rather than moral absolutism. You don't have moral extreme sense, or in a sense of I won't do things. You're more pragmatic or more of an opportunist, in the sense of your moral qualms or your social contracts that you form. So A to C would be you if you never knew God, never came to God, never tried to change your life from making bad decisions and living in a life of outer darkness. A to B would be the life in Christ, and A to D would be your life as if you lived with the knowledge of God but rejected Him completely. And so the line C to D that is drawn through A is the line that is drawn between C and D to connect those two. A connects to all 3 points. So, in a sense, A is here, point B is here, point C is here, point D is here. In the graph, in a sense, although I said I wouldn't draw any charts or explain any charts, now we're just making up them. In a sense, though it's distributed to all of these, state A is still disconnected from all the others, in a sense that C is not connected to B is not connected to D, and vice versa for all of them. So, though they are all derived from the same point, they are all separate. It is only during the intersection point, when one person decides to go voluntarily back to the previous state of A. Well, if one were to draw a line to get to state A, or to get, like, let's just say, each line is explaining a trait of your life. But that also means, like, your life, this entire line means that any point along this line is a you in this series of endless multiple universes. Each and every person on line D would be every single version of me that denied God and continues to reject God despite knowing and have the opportunity to know Him. Line C would be every single version of me that knows of God, or does not know of God at all, never experiences God, but lives in outer darkness and just lives the best life I can do. Line B would be every version of me that sees God, knows God, acknowledges God, and fellowships with God every step of the way. And so as long as you intersect with that line, you develop those traits, or you're intersecting with the you that distributes traits from the lines that are connecting. So thus, if you wanted to, you can go from point B and draw a line to the line point C. And wherever that line intersects, you're going to develop the traits of, okay, I know God, I believe in God, but I still act as if I'm living in darkness. I don't let God be the Lord of my life, so thus I'm living in sin, despite knowing God. Now, the other side would be drawing a line from point B to point D, which would mean that I would be somebody who knows God, believes in God, but chooses to act against Him, chooses to reject Him, and chooses to deny the Christian lifestyle, and instead chooses to forge my own sense of life, whether that's the Luciferian lifestyle of acknowledging God but working against Him, or going the atheist route, or the agnostic route of knowing God, believing in God, but not believing in the faith that God would reveal Himself, seek to organize institutions and human governances that reflect His aspects in nature and His kingdom in heaven, and thus they don't work with that kind of idea of a theocratic worldview, I guess. I wanted to make it simple of explanation. In describing those 3 lines, relapse then would be any occasion where between point A to B, you go to point C or D. So anytime you diverge from point B to D, you go from So you're always moving towards point B, because again, points C, B, and D all represent the end point, and the end point is death. We are all given one life to live. We live it and we die. So between that period of life and death, you have A to B. You start off on point A beforehand, but derive yourself off of it, but eventually get back to point A. But if you've never been to point A, then you've basically been living your entire life either on C or D. In order to get to B, God has to reveal Himself to you and save you. He drags you from the lines of C or D and brings you back into B, where you're in harmony with God and you're in fellowship with God and living in God. But so long as you have connections to these other lines, you're going to draw yourself back to these lines as you travel towards your eventual death. And thus, what really C and D represent are alternative states or conditions by which B can be applied in a sense. So C would be negative, D would be a negative, B would be the positive. And so anytime you have an intersection or the meeting of two different points and you're comparing them, there would be the subtraction from C and D on the B. And this kind of goes into the aspect of the Bible that says that those of us who are saved are more accountable than those who are not saved. Not because those who are unsaved aren't going to be judged or aren't accountable, but that for those of us who know and willingly disobey God, the fruits of our efforts are worse, but more importantly, we're more accountable for it. The tallying up changes because we're making more alterations away from B. So in a sense, if God were to judge you, he would be judging people who never left B, he would be saving anybody who never left B. He'd be looking for anybody who left C and D for B at the right moment of, leaving to redeem them. And anybody who is on C from point A to C or from point A to D would be left behind. They've separated themselves from God. Going to the idea of relapse, though, that's kind of working off of it from a theological angle. Knowing that, going back to the idea of personifying this with the scientist organism type of example that we've been using for this series, if I'm the scientist and I am using myself as the organism by which I am testing this vaccination process of being sin on, what I do is I read the Bible, I pray, I fellowship with God, I do religious practices both publicly and privately in order to help me stay into alignment with God. But more importantly, to work out whatever pathogens or infectious components are inside of me and need to be worked through. Hold on real quick. Apparently we're having issues with the stream. Okay, so understanding that as a scientist, I'm infecting myself with this much in the same way they would infect people with smallpox through the pustules that would form on people who were infected, because if you caught smallpox through other means, it was more dangerous to you. But the initial forms of vaccinations was that you would take a weaker form of smallpox, one form that didn't actually have as much of the same traits as the mainline infestation of it, or getting it through the a general blood-to-blood or saliva transfer instead through the pustule transfer. It actually allowed you to fight through the virus, and you had a better rate of success against the smallpox virus. But there still were many issues with it. You were able to successfully vaccinate many people with it, but there's still many flaws with it. They refined the process in order to produce the current vaccination schedule. Still the same process still, where you use the existing biological material in order to stimulate the nervous system or the immune response and the nervous system into developing the immune response towards that virus or that sort of pathogen. Much in the same way, the Bible, as you take in the Bible, reading the Ten Commandments, understanding the examples of the different people who lived before you in the Bible, and the stories of the failures and the successes, give you a better frame of reference. In a sense, they're your spiritual medicine by which you fight off these pathogens and infections with. So your penicillin would be the gospel, the good news. It'd be giving you right in there. The adrenaline that you need sometimes if you have problems with that would be, reading the Psalms or the Proverbs. So you have different chemicals that are working in this, spiritual chemicals working in this spiritual medicine that are useful for different issues and different things with the organism they're trying to heal. In this case, the self, or a loved one, or society. So a vaccination thus would be derived from us, not, because again, there's one way of avoiding disease. You just avoid the disease, or you destroy the disease, in a sense. If you destroy the disease, then there's no way for you to develop immune response. Eradicate all instances of common cold. Nobody would catch the common cold until somebody came from a land that had common cold, and then you're screwed. And I think that this is the problem that many people face in the Christian church, is that Christians ignore sin, fight against sin. Really, can we just... I don't care if people experience slowdown. Why are you being slow? Oh, unnecessarily obtuse systems. There, is that better if I just slowly get rid of things? Well, you know what? I actually know that this stuff is, broadcasting, so since I know that everything is doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that we're going to still be broadcasting. Close down everything, reset everything, and try not to get annoyed during the process of it. Again, I told you guys one of my problems is that I have to deal with wrath. I get very, very angry very easily. Things frustrate me so much. Oh, I get so frustrated. I just want to break everything in its freaking container. But I have to work on that. It's something that is going to take time, work in the Word, and it's going to help me be able to succeed eventually through this illness that I'm facing. Now, there are theological examples for why there's more to that than just that, but for now, since I'm having internet issues for some stupid reason, we're going to go ahead and just try to wrap this all up with a quick summary of this, and then I'm going to go ahead and discuss my personal shortcomings. Okay, so with the pathogenic analysis view, one would take the sin, one without exposure to sin would be much more susceptible when sin does occur. So if you never experienced any issues with lust, when you finally do encounter a sin issue with lust, you would cave to it much more quickly because your body hasn't built up a resilience to it. There's been no material, no information by which you can go, okay, that's lust. I don't need to be like that. I don't need to be living according to this. Or that's wrath. I don't need to be living according to my wrath. Or this is greed. I don't need to be living to my greed. Or this is gluttony. I don't need to live my gluttony. So on and so forth. So the idea is that without any information on it, if you've never taught anybody about these things, then they're more susceptible to it when it finally occurs because it's going to appeal to them in a different way. Their body's not going to recognize it, and so their body will try to instead absorb it and assimilate it as a normal resource. Then it'll find out much to its dismay that this is more than a bit off into, and then you fall into the stages of decay until you get to loss of control, which is total submission to the sin. Once you've lived in total submission to sin, the pathogen has fully taken over the organism and has basically become genetically compatible to the organism. The organism, in the sense of the typhoid Mary, living with this inner missing the markness towards those particular pathogens. And that one pathogen could trigger the suppressed immune response. Thus, because you're spiritually repressed in your immune response, you're more susceptible to picking up more pathogens, more sins. In the Bible it says, you remove one demon, you're still susceptible to having that demon come back with 7 more. So you have to prepare yourself and be inoculated against these spiritual pathogens that try to infest you. In my case, I had grown up from my point A started off as a point, a point C, then a point D. So I grew up originally in a family that knew God but didn't really basically we didn't talk about God. I didn't really know God. I watched The Passion of Christ as a kid, but I didn't really know God was a God or religion or anything like that until I was around 10 years old. I'd already had a decent view of the world established based off of what I was taught by then, by science, history, all that stuff. So my worldview was already founded without God in it. Then, when I knew God, I accepted Him, but I didn't follow Him. I lived in darkness instead, and I rejected things of God that I didn't know of, sure, so in some ways I was still kind of a C, but I was very much a D in that I rejected a lot of things. I rejected the Christian church and the religious lifestyle, because to me it just didn't seem like it made sense. It didn't make sense to me why I would need to do all these things, or why these things would be beneficial at all. I didn't see the effect. The thing that benefited me is that as I would sit in church with my mother, I would watch people very intently, so intently. I'd watch them because this was more of a charismatic church environment, so people would break down crying. People would call forth to God, and sometimes I could tell, okay, this is more pageantry. Other times I could tell, this is because of a real physiological, emotional issue that is being resolved or brought forth in this individual. So seeing the real physiological and biological changes that happen to people, their characteristic changes, their family changes, their lifestyle changes, which affect them in their genetics. These things I've seen happen in the church and through religious lifestyles. So that changed me, brought me back more willing to go along the B path. So I went from D to B. And then I wavered back and forth between all 3 groups, like most human beings do, until I finally decided I wanted to come to Christ, went to B. But at moments though I living with Christ, there were moments where I was ignorant, thus going to C, and also at times where I chose to go against God, which means I would go into B or D. Those moments since I converted meant that, because when you convert, Your whole life before that moment with God, it's gone and forgiven. He just lets it go. You are a new creation in Christ. You've been redeemed through his blood and through his death on the cross, and through the partaking of his flesh and blood through the Eucharist, the unleavened bread and the wine. Then you have been joined to the kingdom, especially because you've done that. You've been baptized in the name of the Holy Spirit, which has killed the old man. You've crossed over through the waters of chaos onto the promised land of heaven, to the kingdom of Christ, where you have found salvation and peace in this current life, but also in the life promised to be. So in doing so, you have this kind of like middle state. So you remove it all, this becomes your new point of origin. Then this is where we came from in the beginning, point B. If you choose from then to go to point C and D, all of this is noted to God. He can forgive you if you seek repentance and ask God to forgive you, but there are some things that God says in the Bible, you will reap the fruits and you will be rewarded in heaven according to your works on this earth. You will be held accountable for the things that you do according to the truth that you acknowledge and the truth that you have decided to live, according to what I've told you in my word. So the idea is that we read the word of God, but we have to figure out how to follow God according to that word and bring that to fruit, to life in this world. It's the seed, we plant it, we find the right land to plant it, we cultivate that land and that seed, and we grow crop. And we feed off that crop, and we give that crop to others, and allow others to glean from that crop so that humanity can grow into a more perfect or more Edenistic form of humanity that is aligned with God. So that's kind of the process by which you get to point B. Then point B causes divisions. So in my case, I've had plenty of moments where I waver back and forth before trying to get back to this B level. And the goal is to try to reduce the level of wavering between point C and D and point B. The less you have these disruptions between you going to C or going to D and returning back to B, the more you are walking along the path of Christ. The better you've stabilized your path along the series of U's that are supposed to be U all the way through on B. And if one were to apply this into the idea of God theology and the idea of having multiple realities, the idea is that because God is outside time, space, and reality in this universe, all universes with us, God would still be outside of. So all universes would still be applicable to God's omnipotence and all of his qualities and traits, and still to his influence and authority over them. Meaning that all things that exist within these things, and all versions of life and organisms that derive from these different timeline points, the infinite that must exist, if this is to be true, are all in existence. And if one were to apply that to the biblical lifestyle, then that means that God is actively, because he says he is a farmer, he's one who trims and maintains all of reality, that means that God is fine-tuning each and every alternate reality so that, one, we got to the point of human beings, two, we got to the point of human beings who know of a Jesus, and three, we got to a point where human beings know of a Jesus and you've been created, and now we need to get to the point where human beings have been created, Jesus is acknowledged, you have been created, now you need to acknowledge Jesus, and then you create your next part or the next branch of humanity. Because again, one child means there's an infinite timeline of children who have to figure out the CBD issue. Those children are going to have their children. Same thing. If you have 3 children, that's 3 people with an infinite amount of lives to figure this out, and also an infinite amount of influences on the infinite amount of lives of all of the human beings who have existed beforehand. So the idea is that for such a being, constantly working through all of these things and fine-tuning them, it would still behoove you to figure out which path you want to do or be along the line, because the stream of alternate lifestyles that you can create through your choices would still have a ripple effect and affect many more versions of you than the you that currently decides that he's going to be affected by the situation. Worse still, if your decisions in the present invalidate the infinite numbers of yous, basically the current you that decides to make a video on YouTube killed every single form of you who is working up to the point where they wouldn't make a video during this moment. Well, if that's happening, then that's even more important for you to make life decisions that are right living. So again, the whole idea is that you may, if you are blessed, if you're lucky, if God is with you in that kind of way, then you will be blessed and won't have the thorns that keep you wavering back and forth. For some of us, Like Paul said, we have thorns that we have to work through, and God relieves and pulls those thorns out of us, our crown of thorns, as we bear our cross. And so for me, it's bearing my cross that helps me slowly breaking free of the sins of my past. Not so much that I haven't broken free of my sins of my past, but that in the sense that though I am free of them, and though I try to live without them enacting in my life, at the same time, there is still an inexplicable drawing of my dead flesh, because it hasn't been fully recreated, because I'm still in this life. I still haven't seen Jesus come back and transform me in an instant. I still struggle with it, because the old man is dead, but his body, those who serve him, the idea, the organism that I was, is still alive, infected with the pathogen. The me that has the inoculation, that has the cure, still has to fight out the infection. And that's through the work of the Holy Spirit in your life. But we don't always walk in the Holy Spirit. And we don't always fellowship with the Holy Spirit. And we don't always communicate with the Holy Spirit. And therein allows the pathogen to overtake the new man and reduce his immune response and his ability to fight out the infection to reclaim the body. Because again, you've already been taken over by the enemy. So your body is infested with an STD. You need something that is as voracious, as ruthless, and as thorough as an STD in a sense, to reinfect you, take you over, and push out the other infection. And so that's why it's hard for people to come into religious lifestyles, to come into fellowship with God, because you are reinfecting yourself with a pathogen after already being infected with another pathogen. But this time, your immune response doesn't recognize that this isn't a pathogen, this is the cure. So instead of allowing the cure to come into you, or trying to assimilate the cure like you did beforehand, your body already knows it's infected with something, and it's going, oh no, we can't take any more. And it fights against the inoculation. In my own life, I've been struggling with wrath, sin, bouts of gluttony. I comfort eat. And so my spending habits are affected by when I feel depressed, I eat a lot of food. And I eat a lot of food out because I don't want to cook when I'm sad. Because I usually cook when I have other people around me. I grew up in a family of social cooks. So I believe it is more comfortable for me in those situations where I feel like I'm making food for more than just myself to eat. So there are periods where I'll either won't eat or will eat too much food because I'm just feeling a certain way. Same thing with wrath. There are moments where I'm extremely peaceful and you just can't move me to anger. There are moments where there's an anchor in me that has a foundation that is very bottomless, and it scares me to even think of how many things I've really just been shoving into that pit because I didn't want to deal with them, that are now, as I've learned to become more accountable for myself, my thoughts, my actions, and my behavior, and my influence in society, but more so how I feel about myself, I've begun to realize that this pit isn't so bottomless. And now that the light's coming into my life and God's shining it through this pit, I now see what's at the bottom of this pit, and I get pissed. I get so mad at people, at myself, at my environment, just angry, ruthless, vindictive, vengeful. And that goes along with the rest. I did not understand how much I wanted a family, how much I wanted to be married, how much I wanted to be a husband, until God entered my life, showed me what a family actually could be, what I would want in a family, what family I came from, what families I get along with and would like around me. Once I started seeing those things, I began to realize, oh, there's so much that I see wrongly in my interests that I use in order to alleviate the stress that I feel, because I feel like it's too much of a hassle. It's too hard, it's too impossible to find somebody that would love me, find somebody that, well, not even just love me, find somebody who can share love, whom I can share love with, whom I can share compatibility with, whom I can share weaknesses and fallibility and vulnerabilities with, and whom we can share a common path and a common narrative, and whom I can also share a common faith with, or a common belief system with, or structure of how the world works. Not necessarily in every single way, but at least in the most important things, like there's something batting for us so that we don't have to kill ourselves. That would be important to me, because if my wife killed herself, I would probably kill myself, because I am not that safe in terms of working through my life, because one of my biggest fears is that I will end up alone. And so to me, the biggest thing that I fear is having a partner that will kill herself, or leave me, or take the kids and run, or make me out into some horrible monster and fight me the entire relationship of our marriage when we don't have to be enemies. So these are things that scare me so much. It's actually easier to go to a false idol as porn, or to my own fantasies, because again, pornography is just the use of an idol that is a prostitute. So you're using an idol or an image as a prostitute. If you are fantasizing, you're still using porn. You're still using porn if you're fantasizing about, having sex. So it's the same process. You're still idolizing a false wife. The wife who's not actually your wife. You're not focusing on the qualities that makes a wife a good wife. And actually, I wonder if there is a form of thinking about sex and sexuality and having that with your partner that is biblical and can be had without leading to the same kind of lust response that leads to masturbation, that leads to sex out of wedlock and the like. I wonder if there is a possible way of doing that, and if so, does it have to focus on where you're putting the focus on, rather than the flesh and of the skins of flesh that we wear, in order to make us more appealing and more like a particular spouse? Like, oh, he's cute because he's got a good face, he's got the money, he's got job security, he's got an organization. Those are coverings of flesh over the body of flesh. But the internal environment, the soul, the mind, the emotions, those are the things that need to be worked through. And again, the emotions are still affected by the sin self, so those you don't really even want to go through. You need to know the personal thoughts of your significant other. You need to know the emotional reactions of your significant other. You need to see them act around others and act around you and act around people that they're uncomfortable with and comfortable with. That way you see them in every environment. You should know them in the way that you should know God. And they should know you in the way that they know God. More importantly, you guys should serve each other as you serve God. And more importantly, you should see each other as Christ in your life. So your wife, as a man, is Christ to you. She is the one who died to redeem you. She is the one who dies to redeem you and to make you a better man. You are the Christ to her, and you died for her to give her the ability to be the woman of God that she is to be. These are the traits by which we form families. And for me, that anxiety is so hard to deal with that I go instead for lust. It's easier. I don't have to talk to them. They don't have to like me. We don't have to share faith. It's 5 minutes. I'm done. I'm happy. But that 5 minutes, which more often than not is more likely 2 hours for the 5 minutes, because it's 2 hours of fine-tuning, selecting, figuring out which one you actually want to watch or focus on, millions of videos that you watch is kind of and then 5 minutes, or, Lord forbid, either way it's Lord forbid, but Lord forbid, you just, and you get it out of your system. Either way, you're still damaging yourself unilaterally. One, it takes hours for you to build up the byproduct that you're expelling. It takes about your biomass basically to do that. It affects your emotions through the hormone manipulation. It's basically a drug. So you're getting high in a sense through this process of the adrenaline and the release of bonding hormones that is naturally released when you go and have intercourse and reproductive activities with each other. These things that happen affect you, and they cause you to have damage to your body, to yourself, and to your soul. This is the effects of the lust pathogen. The effects of the wrath pathogen. You get more, when you're indecisive, you're more irritable, you're more indifferent to other people, you're lacking empathy, you're more likely to see people as enemies, you're more likely to self-victimize, you're more likely to self-exalt. If not self-victimize, then it's usually self-exalting. These are the issues and the reflections of having the wrath pathogen, the gluttony pathogen, periods of extreme eating or non-eating, periods of extreme spending or non-spending, periods of extreme excessivity of self or of people. These are the forms of gluttony that the gluttony pathogen release into you. And so in discussing the idea of relapse, what relapse is actually the reemergence of the existing pathogen, the return of the existing pathogen's effect on the body because of a temporary suspending or disruption or issue with the body's immune response. Thus, you relapse when you are not keeping to your spiritual medicine. And that's what I've been realizing from this, at least from my observations of my sins. I've been doing really well with giving up drinking. I drink very rarely, and if so, it's definitely not to alcoholism, and it's definitely not because I'm sad anymore, which is good. That was a major reason why I needed to stop drinking, was because I was drinking because I was sad, felt alone, and felt like if I drank, it was easier to put myself into the material or things around me so that I could break free of this self-little prison I felt like I was in. Likewise, the same thing with lust. I use that to cope and to avoid issues. Thus, in refocusing towards it, the medicine is going to help me actually engage people, talk to people, tell people that I appreciate them more. Want to build connections with people rather than fearing that these connections will wither away or dull with time or turn negative in my life or toxic in my life. And thus, overwhelming that fear will allow me to engage in people and eventually start a relationship, actually be able to trust somebody, be willing to start a relationship, because that's why I am not in a relationship right now. I want to be in one. I could rush and be in one, but I know that every step of the way I'm constantly reflecting, even when I'm dating around with people, that okay, it's not time, because I need to be able to trust someone. And most people that I meet, it's hard for me to feel like I can trust them, especially in those ways that I defined. Thus, until I find a healthy means, medicine, vitamins, therapy, to deal with these sins, I'll forever be traumatized by them and at issue with them and struggling with them. And ultimately, that's really what I kind of wanted to get across to you guys, is that that's what we're really working against. Now, for part 3, we'll continue on like we usually do. There will be charts and ideas and fun stuff if I have them. But for now, that's not going to be something we get into for the next day or so. I'm working tomorrow, so I probably won't talk to you guys. Oh yeah, I'm back and working again. So that will be fun. So probably it'll be a Friday video. Instead, today, probably going to give you guys the video on theocracy, and that will be that. Pardon my burp. I want you all to have a blessed week. Make the best of it, even if you failed. Do the best you can each day. Try to be the best you can be each day. Trust me, it's easy to fall behind when you're mostly alone, and when you don't engage with people for most of the day, and when most of your engagement is through mediums such as Zoom or the internet or video games and stuff like that. It's so easy. It's so easy to sit on your own, but you have to go through that. And that's as much as for me as it is to you guys. We get through this together, but we also have to get through this on our own. Because we're never on our own, and that's the point. You thinking that you're on your own means that you're not in God, which means that you're not taking your spiritual medicine. And that's what I've realized from this last week of kind of relapsing for a day, doing well for a couple days, and relapsing again. So, stay blessed, everybody. Look out for each other. And remember, the flock is out there in the wilderness, but it's also behind the gates. You have to get to know the flock in the gates in order to see the flock outside the gates. There's no use trying to protect something you think is a sheep if it's a goat and it doesn't belong to you. If it's not part of your shepherd's flock, then you don't have to worry about it. But that doesn't mean you kill goats when you see them in the wilderness. No, you return them to their owner. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto Christ what is Christ's. So, even though we're Christians, and even though the atheists or the agnostics don't want to deal with us, we still want to deal with them. And we still want to take care of them, teach them, mentor them, heal them, love them, guide them. We may get pissed off by them. We may get enraged by them. The things they say, they may not realize completely spit all over the things that we believe in. And the frustration and rage that we can feel towards those outside, as a collective, may be justified. But the individual is still worth redemption. And the individual is still worth fellowship. And the individual is still worth love. Because love is given to you from Christ. And you did not deserve it. And you did not earn it. And you certainly do not maintain it. And if you think that you maintain that love of God because of your own self and because of how awesome you are, 1, you haven't read the book of Job, 2, you don't understand Christianity, 3, you don't understand God, and 4, you're in for a rude awakening because as perfect as you may be, God's going to come in and hit you with some hard stuff that's going to test you and make you want to waver, to make you want to judge God or question God or be confused by God or to not know God or walk with God at different points in your life. And at some point, that wonderful A to B is going to waver to an A to C or an A to D. And if you have not questioned whether or not you're ready or even capable, in fact, if you haven't even taken the time to see if there are spiritual medicine that you may be needing because there's an infestation going around your environment, well then, that's on you. And honestly, that's how I look at all things. Vaccinations should work like this. Is smallpox within our population, then inoculate for the smallpox. If it's not in our population and we're not facing it, then why are we inoculating with it? Deal with it when it shows up and allow God to handle the rest. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar. Give unto God what is God's. Diseases are Caesar. That's the devil's first shade. Devil deals in death and decay and disruption. That is how the devil creates life. It's for the destruction of life and the recomposition of God's life. So diseases, pathogens, the corruption of nature to cause havoc to humanity, all these things we go, why God, why didn't you stop it? God just looks back and goes, why man, why didn't you just listen to me? And that's why we deal with it. So again, the idea that we blame God for all these things in the world because, oh, just because you created all things means you also created evil. That's not how that works. Evil is a state of being. It's a state of being that exists whenever you don't act in God. So God can't create evil. God can only place himself and create things that are of God. Things that are of God are going to have God's traits and natures, and as soon as they leave God's self, or his nature and presence, they're going to lose that state of having God's nature as they start to achieve the nature of that which is around them or that which is replacing God in their life. And God says that in the Bible through and through. Don't understand why that's such a hard thing for atheists to understand. I don't even understand why it took me a year to figure that out. That was so freaking obvious. When I finally understood, I was like, wow, I'm an idiot. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this isn't rocket science. It is not. In fact, if anything, we are repurposing that which we already knew should have been out there, and that which we have now found to explain that which is now understood, or at least perceived to be understood, and we're reapplying it to that which we've always known. We're just taking science, applying it to theology, and using it to heal ourselves and those around us. So again, think outside the fox, people. Think outside the box, people. And probably you might want to think outside the fox. Foxes are quite crafty creatures, and they're quite manipulative. And if we're constantly thinking that the whole world is built to sabotage, rape, and scavenge, then we're never going to believe in a world that's better than the utopian societies that we come up with in our own minds. Because again, I hate using the term that Christianity believes in a utopia. Marxists believe in a utopia. Racists believe in a utopia. Capitalists believe in a utopia. People who believe in technocracy and globalism believe in a utopia. Because all of them believe that the nature of man can be fundamentally changed through the works of man and through the regimentation and creation of a society that controls how man actualizes and reproduces and participates in the world around him. Theocracy, or at least since most theocracies, if they are biblically based and focused on Christ, would be based around the idea that the individual is redeemable, that though you have failures and flaws, you can always do better, that though things are bad now, that there's always situations that can be derived from it, and that there was a state previous of perfection that can be re-achieved, not permanently, but through constant self-maintenance, and self-accountability, and self-exposure. And self-actualization comes through self-exposure, so thus they lead to the self-actualization that other people quickly try to create synthetically through, media, through moralism movements, things like that. And the moralism movements of religions, such as the Great Awakening and things like that, those, again, come through the same means. A lot of what is modern liberalism and progressive movements, a lot of what built the left, ironically enough, is the very religion that most of them are scarred by. Most people that fill up the left are scarred by religion, hate religion largely because of that, or they just try to stay away from it because they feel it's the opiate of the masses, and, ironically enough, create a religious and moralistic worldview to replace it. Because they don't have that, so they can't actually leave it. When you have a religious and moral structure that is based on religious ideology, I have my political views. I have my views of society. But as much as I may judge or think or discriminate or stereotype the world around me, I know that God has his own judgments on the society, and they may not line up with my own. And thus, I must always be accountable to God for my own thoughts, my own actions, my own beliefs about the people around me and myself. That forces me to break out of that. It forces me to break out of this idea of false morality. I don't have false morality because I know that I'm doing something good because it's right, not because I want to be right or because I believe that this is the right thing because this is what's the best thing, it makes the most good. No, this is right for the moment. Handing somebody money right now is not going to help them because I know they're going to use it for something bad. But handing this person money at this moment is good because this is the right moment where I know that they'll most likely use it for the best means. And insofar as I can't decide either, I leave to God. This is the basic deistic problem solving. Since apparently to be a deist, you could basically be a Christian who just uses pragmatic thinking in order to create policies and social contracts in this world with those who may not share your political beliefs or may not be as, I guess, zealous or fanatical as you could be in order of holding yourself self-accountable to God. So the idea being that, honestly, deism of the Founding Fathers was nothing different than the Christianity that we have. Deists of our Founding Fathers' age were not the atheists and agnostics that we see today in this culture because, again, they knew what paganism was. They knew what other societies were. They knew what it was like to live under a globalized faith. So, again, this was not what they were on about back then, but we're getting sidetracked. This is all extra stuff anyways, it's not even part of the lecture. Long story short, rethink how you look at the world, rethink about how you think of yourself as an organism, and also think of yourself as a scientist, and start investigating the claims of the world around you. You don't investigate biblical claims by going, God, turn this water into wine. That's not how you do it. Instead, you go, God, how is it that water is similar to wine, and how is it that water becomes wine? Then you ask yourself, how is it that Christ did it? And if so, what does this mean? For Christ to turn something to wine, grape juice to wine, that means it had to ferment. So again, Christ either allowed the wine to ferment, or it was likely grape juice. This is the reason that people use in order to say, no, Christ did not let himself get drunk. What's wrong about that is that this was at a wedding, so it was probably a combination of both. They probably had bad wine, which would be that which is fermented. Then you would have good wine, which is that which is, grape juice, basically. And then, honestly, I believe that Christ created a wine that was different fundamentally from what we see in the current wine that we have. Current wine is based off of fermentation. I believe that the wine that Christ created wasn't based off of fermentation. Instead, I think the ambient qualities that basically what produces taste in a product is the process of decay and fermentation in the alcohol. That's what gives it its taste and how you do it, how you control its process and what chemicals and influences you put into that fermentation process for those bacteria to kind of ferment from. That influences the flavor. I think it's the same thing. I think God created something without fermenting it, and in a sense, it self-generated that quality. This was wine actualized. Rather than rotting, this was wine creating life within the people that it drank, still creating the same effect of, in a sense, being drunk, but they weren't drunk in the way where their body's reacting with the toxicity response. Instead, their body was probably treating it like they drank the best water they ever freaking had. And that's probably why they made the comment, normally, a family would bring out the worst wine and feed it to us first and save the best wine for last so that when we're drunk, or no, they bring out the best, they do that. But you bring out the best wine first. So the idea is that, I believe that a large part of what God does is through invalidating death. And so without death, without decay, without destruction, and the understanding of that process, the understanding of evolution, the understanding of all these things, you can't properly understand how God created the world by thus invalidating them. The reason why I believe in evolution is not that I believe in long-form evolution, but I believe that there are processes by which decaying organisms intergenerationally try to preserve themselves from decaying quicker. And that process is how they, in a genetic and physical sense, seek to reaching that perfect state of stability where their telomeres, the part of your DNA structure that has to stay stable in order for the cells to keep reproducing themselves properly without any decay. Because what happens basically when you suffer organ failure and deterioration that leads to your death from old age, that is because your body's unable to keep copying itself. That didn't exist as so long as you were of God. And so when you're in the presence of God, your cells are able to perfectly recompile themselves, or copy themselves. Same process by which most things would work in the world would be similar. It's more of a redemptive process. So whatever it is that we are now is without the presence of God, and thus without that secondary process of repentance working in our DNA, working in our environment. Our goal, thus, in our study of spiritual immunology, is thus to find out the processes by which we can boost the organism's immune response, our spiritual immune response, the SIS, or no, the SIR. That would probably be the best. Oh no, response system. So it'd be SIRM, SIRM. Yeah, it'd be SIRM, the spiritual immune response system. So, anyways, sorry, I'm being a dork. So the idea would be that you're working through this stuff. We take on this process and learn it into us, and then we're going to practice it. So by the time we finish this, we're going to be practicing this idea. And a big thing that we're going to have to be ready to deal with is relapse. And what we're going to have to focus on as well is which relapses qualify which state of pathogenic infestation. Looking back at when we were talking about the different types of pathogens, we need to start being able to identify which pathogen is affecting who. We can't say that somebody's infected by a demon until we figure out what demons actually affect him, and if it's a demon. It might not be a bacterium. It might just be a prion. You may have just made a bad choice that became a bad habit. And that right there is why you have a pathogen. You may have a demonic influence because your mom used to be a witch, or somebody did a curse on you. That is a bacterium infection. That's very different. And these pathogens need to be understood by us as spiritual physicians in order to apply the gospel, the spiritual medicine, in the right ways. And so I'm going to leave you with that, shepherds. Get in them books. Keep learning. Grow wise and grow fat from your knowledge and walk with the Lord. Your knowledge and awareness of the Lord. Grow fat from that. Eat it up. Consume it. Love it. Stay safe. Trying to think about if I have anything else I want to say. One last bit. Nah. I'm pretty much done. Remember, everybody, like and subscribe. Leave comments if you have. If you have any ideas, let me know, and I'll discuss it with you guys.